The shadows in the warehouse were long and jagged, cast by the flicker of a single bare bulb that hummed with the same nervous energy as the man tied to the chair. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the cold concrete floor, the steam from his breath visible in the winter air. His tailored suit was a sharp contrast to the grime of the shipping docks, but his expression was even colder than the steel beams overhead. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The head of the Seoul Syndicate led by silence. The man in the chair, a trusted lieutenant who had dared to sell shipment routes to the Busan Syndicate, was weeping. A pathetic sound that echoed off the corrugated walls. Ji-hoon watched him not with anger, but with a detached, clinical observation, as if he were looking at a piece of machinery that had finally outlived its usefulness. "You were family," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. He stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking with rhythmic precision on the floor. He didn't reach for his gun immediately. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture so mundane it made the traitor's sobbing hitch in terror. To Ji-hoon, loyalty was the only currency that mattered in a world built on blood and shadow. When that currency was debased, the debt had to be settled in full. With a fluid, predator-like grace, he drew his weapon. One shot, muffled by the cavernous space, silenced the warehouse. He didn't look back as he handed the pistol to his security chief. He had an empire to maintain, and a throne made of iron required a foundation of fear. The drive back to the mansion was a silent transit between two different worlds. As the black sedan glided through the iron gates of his estate, the ruthlessness of the warehouse began to shift into a different kind of tension, one born of helplessness rather than power. The mansion was a fortress of marble and glass, sprawling and magnificent, yet inside it felt like a mausoleum. The scent of expensive leather and aged whiskey was increasingly overwhelmed by the sharp clinical tang of antiseptic. Ji-hoon crossed the foyer, his footsteps echoing through the hollow halls. Every luxury he owned was a testament to his control over the city. Yet, as he approached the wing housing the nursery, that control vanished. He paused at the heavy oak doors of the twins' room, his hand hovering over the handle. This was the only place in the world where his name meant nothing. The dragon of Seoul could move mountains and topple governments, but he could not force air into his son's failing lungs. Inside, the hum of high-tech ventilators provided a mechanical heartbeat that mocked his own. He watched through the glass partition, seeing the tiny, fragile forms of Minjun and Eumji. Minjun's skin was a haunting, pale gray, a sight that had become the centerpiece of Ji-hoon's nightmares. The best doctors in the country, paid in sums that could buy entire city blocks, had offered nothing but grim nods and complicated jargon. He retreated to his office, a room filled with ancient books and the blue glow of surveillance monitors. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey, the amber liquid shaking slightly in his hand before he regained his composure. He sat in his leather chair, his eyes fixed on the screens that displayed every corner of the nursery. He had just ended a life to protect his business. Now he was prepared to end 20 more to protect his blood. But as he watched the empty room, waiting for the new caretaker to arrive, he felt the crushing weight of his own limitation. He sat upon an iron throne, but in the silence of the night, he was just a man watching a screen, waiting for a miracle he didn't believe in to save the only things he truly loved. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the heavy, charcoal-tinted windows of the mansion, leaving the foyer in a state of perpetual, expensive twilight. Ji-hoon stood at the top of the grand staircase, his hands clasped behind his back, looking down at the woman who had just been ushered through the heavy front doors. She was a stark contrast to the monochromatic perfection of his home. Zara stood with a weathered duffel bag at her feet, her skin a deep, rich mahogany against the sterile white marble. She didn't cower under the oppressive scale of the architecture, nor did she flinch at the 2 stone-faced guards flanking her. She simply stood, her eyes tracking the movement of the dust motes in the light, waiting with a patience that Ji-hoon found unsettling. Below, the household staff had gathered like a choir of judgmental ghosts. The head housekeeper, a woman who had served Ji-hoon's family for decades, didn't bother to hide the curl of her lip. There was a palpable friction in the air, a silent consensus among the staff that this outsider was an insult to the house. They whispered in hushed Korean, their words sharp and jagged, assuming the foreign woman couldn't understand the weight of their disdain. They saw her background in rural traditional care not as a skill, but as a primitive desperation that had no place in a sanctuary of modern medicine and mafia millions. To them, she was a stain on the silk. To Ji-hoon, she was a last resort he already regretted. Ji-hoon descended the stairs, his presence silencing the room instantly. He stopped 3 paces from Zara, his gaze raking over her with the same cold scrutiny he used for a police informant. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask about her journey. He saw a woman who looked tired, whose clothes were simple, and whose presence felt like a gamble he was destined to lose. In his mind, she was either a spy sent by someone who knew his heart was buried in that nursery, or a charlatan looking for a payout. His prejudice was a thick, invisible wall. He could not conceive that someone from her world could possess anything his world lacked. "The rules are simple," Ji-hoon said, his English precise and devoid of warmth. "You follow the doctor's protocols. You do not touch what is not yours. You do not speak of what you see inside these walls. If the children cry, you alert the medical staff. You are a pair of hands, nothing more." Zara met his eyes then, and for a fleeting second Ji-hoon saw a flash of something that wasn't fear. It was pity. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a professional mask, but the sting of it lingered. She nodded once, a gesture of understanding rather than subservience, and allowed the housekeeper to lead her toward the service wing. As soon as she was out of sight, Ji-hoon turned to his security chief, his face hardening into a mask of pure paranoia. "I want her under a microscope," he commanded. "I don't care about privacy laws. I want the feeds live, high definition, and thermal. I want to see the heat of her breath if she gets too close to them." He spent the rest of the afternoon personally supervising the installation of the trap. Technicians moved like shadows, embedding pinhole lenses into the eyes of stuffed animals, the moldings of the ceiling, and the underside of the changing table. By nightfall, Ji-hoon was back in his sanctuary, the door locked, the lights dimmed. He sat before the wall of monitors, the blue light reflecting in his dark pupils like a digital fever. He watched as Zara entered the nursery for her first shift, her movements slow and deliberate. He gripped the arms of his chair, his thumb tracing the cold steel of the pistol resting on the desk. He wasn't watching to see his children get better. He was watching to catch her failing. He was waiting for the moment she reached for a silver spoon or fell asleep on duty, so he could justify the darkness he felt toward her. He had set the stage for a betrayal, certain that by morning he would be throwing her out into the cold, proving that in his world, trust was a luxury that only the dead could afford. The silence of the mansion at 2 a.m. was a physical weight, broken only by the low electrical hum of the surveillance suite. Ji-hoon sat motionless in the center of the room, the blue glow of a dozen screens washing over his features, turning his skin into a mask of cold porcelain. He was the blue eye, the invisible observer of a world he controlled with an iron fist. Yet as he watched the nursery feed, his pulse thrummed with a jagged, nervous rhythm. On the main monitor, Zara moved through the shadows of the nursery like a ghost. She didn't know she was being dissected by a man who considered mercy a weakness. She didn't know that every breath she took was being measured against his deep-seated suspicion. He watched her approach the medical station, a sleek, stainless steel counter stocked with the most expensive pharmaceuticals money could buy. According to the doctor's strict schedule, it was time for the twin supplemental immune boosters, a series of prescribed vitamins meant to stabilize their erratic heart rates. Ji-hoon's hand tightened around the heavy crystal of his whiskey glass. as he saw her pick up the small amber bottle. He expected to see her check the label, draw the syringe, and follow the protocol that his millions had dictated. Instead, Zara did something that made the air vanish from his lungs. She unscrewed the cap, held the liquid to the dim light of a nursing lamp, and paused. She didn't look like a nurse in that moment. She looked like an apex predator sensing a trap. She brought the bottle to her nose, her eyes narrowing in the grainy infrared footage. Then, with a casual, terrifying finality, she walked over to the sink and emptied the entire contents down the drain. Ji-hoon surged to his feet, the heavy leather chair skidding backward with a violent screech. His blood turned to liquid fire. To him, and this wasn't just a deviation, it was an act of war. It was the outsider poisoning his children by withholding the very things keeping them alive. He reached for the Beretta on his desk, his knuckles white as he gripped the textured handle. His mind raced with the blackest images. This woman was a plant, a saboteur sent by his rivals to finish what the illness had started. He slammed his palm against the door's electronic release, ready to storm down the hall and end her life before she could take another step toward the incubators. But he stopped, his hand trembling on the doorframe, as he saw her reach into the deep pockets of her own apron. She pulled out a small, unlabeled glass vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid, something she had brought into his house past his security, past his guards, past his blue eye. He watched, paralyzed by a mixture of homicidal rage and a sudden, inexplicable curiosity, as she began to prepare a new solution. She didn't use the sterile syringes. She used a dropper, mixing the dark liquid with a base of warm water she had prepared in a thermos. She approached Minjun's incubator first. Ji-hoon's finger hovered over the intercom, his voice ready to roar a death sentence, but he found himself held captive by the way she touched the glass. There was no clinical distance in her movements. She whispered something, a low, rhythmic chant that the microphones barely caught. A sound that felt ancient and grounded in a way his marble halls were not. She gently administered the drops to the boy's lips. Ji-hoon held his breath, expecting the monitors to scream, expecting the heart rate alarms to wail in protest of this unauthorized intrusion. Instead, the jagged red line on the vitals monitor began to smooth. The frantic, shallow spikes of Minjun's breathing slowed, deepening into a rhythm Ji-hoon hadn't seen in months. The boy's tiny hand, usually clenched in a pained fist, relaxed against the sterile sheet. Ji-hoon lowered his weapon, the cold steel feeling suddenly heavy and useless. He sank back into his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen as Zara moved toward the second twin. He was a man who understood violence and greed, but he was looking at something he couldn't name, something that sat right in the center of his prejudice, and began to pull it apart. One thread at a time. He wouldn't kill her yet. He would watch. He would wait to see if this was a miracle or a slow, calculated murder. By the third night, the surveillance room no longer felt like a command center. It felt like a confessional. Ji-hoon sat in the persistent gloom, his eyes bloodshot, staring at the telemetry data that defied every report his high-priced specialists had ever filed. The numbers on the glowing monitors were steady, rhythmic, and undeniably healthy. For weeks, the nursery had been a place of digital screaming, alarms that signaled oxygen drops and heart rate spikes. But under Zara's watch, the machines had fallen into a peaceful silence. Minjun's skin, once the color of bruised lilies, had taken on a soft, translucent glow. The blue eye saw everything. The way the boy's chest rose and fell without the desperate hitch of a failing engine, and the way Mji reached out, no longer agitated by the phantom pains of her condition. Ji-hoon watched as Zara finished the midnight feeding, not with the standard plastic bottles, but with the glass dropper she kept hidden in the folds of her uniform. His prejudice told him to call it witchcraft, to see it as a violation of his superior world, but the data on the screen was a silent judge. He realized with a jolt of cold clarity that his children weren't just surviving, they were recovering. The woman he had labeled as an outsider, a potential spy he had been ready to execute, was doing with her hands and her vials what his entire empire could not buy. As the clock struck 3 a.m., Zara settled into the rocking chair between the two incubators. The high-definition cameras caught the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face, the bruising under her eyes from 72 hours of hypervigilance. She didn't sleep. Instead, she leaned her head back and began to hum. It was a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the nursery and into the surveillance room. Then, she began to sing. The language was foreign to Ji-hoon, a soulful, earthy dialect that sounded like the very soil of a distant continent, but the emotion required no translation. It was a song of endurance, of borrowed love, and of a promise to stand between a child and the dark. Her voice was rich and textured, carrying the weight of generations who had survived on nothing but hope. As the melody drifted through the audio feed, Ji-hoon saw Minjun's tiny fingers curl around the air, as if trying to hold on to the sound itself. In the darkness of his office, the Dragon of Soul felt a crack in his iron exterior. He looked at the pistol resting on the marble desk, the weapon he had intended to use on her, and felt a sudden, visceral wave of shame. He had been looking for a villain because his world was populated by them. He had assumed she was small, greedy, or treacherous because he had forgotten that goodness could exist without a price tag. Watching her cradle his children, children who shared none of her blood, with a tenderness that bordered on the sacred, Ji-hoon felt the first pang of a guilt so sharp it made his breath hitch. He was a man who had built a throne on the bodies of those who crossed him, yet he was currently being humbled by a woman who owned nothing but a duffel bag and a song. He realized that while he had been watching her for signs of betrayal, she had been fighting a war for his children's lives. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the glass of the monitor where Zara's face was displayed. For the first time in a lifetime of violence, Ji-hoon didn't feel like a king. He felt like a beggar, standing outside the warmth of a fire he didn't deserve to sit by. The thaw had begun, a slow and painful melting of the ice around his heart, leaving him vulnerable to a truth he wasn't yet ready to face. He was the monster in the house, and she was the only thing keeping the lights on. The fourth night brought a shift in the air, a sharpening of the tension that Zara felt in the very marrow of her bones. While the twins slept in a state of grace they hadn't known since birth, Zara stood at the medical station, her eyes fixed on the row of amber bottles she had systematically emptied into the drain. Her instincts had told her the chemistry was wrong, but now her eyes found the proof. Under the harsh, focused beam of the nursery's examination light, she noticed a faint crystalline residue crusting the threads of a fresh cap, a fine white powder that didn't belong in a liquid vitamin supplement. She dipped a finger into the sediment and brought it to her tongue. The bitter, metallic sting that followed was the taste of a slow-acting neurotoxin, a chemical designed not to kill with a bang, but to wither with a whisper. The realization hit her like a physical blow, sending a shudder through her frame. She wasn't just in a house of wealth and stone, she was in a nest of vipers. The specialists Ji-hoon trusted, the pristine syringes, the carefully labeled vials, they weren't tools of healing. They were the delivery system for a systematic assassination. Someone in Ji-hoon's inner circle was poisoning his legacy, one drop at a time, ensuring that the heir to the Soul Syndicate would never grow strong enough to take his father's place. Zara looked toward the heavy oak door, feeling the immense weight of the fortress surrounding her. She was a woman with no status, no weapons, and no allies, standing between a mafia king and the ghosts of his own house. In the surveillance room, Ji-hoon leaned so close to the monitors that the blue light etched the fine lines around his eyes into sharp relief. He watched Zara's face transform from professional calm to a mask of sheer, cold terror. He saw her hands shake as she examined the bottle, and for a moment, his old paranoia flared. Was she preparing a new dose? But then he saw her expression change again, hardening into a look of fierce, protective rage. She didn't look like a spy. She looked like a soldier realizing she was behind enemy lines. He watched, breathless, as Zara began a frantic, silent reorganization of the nursery. She pulled the official medicine bottles from the cabinet, but instead of throwing them away where they might be found, she began to hide them. She tucked them into the deep recesses of the diaper disposal bins, behind the books on the high shelves, and inside the sterile linings of the equipment cases. She replaced the contents with harmless saline and the dark herbal tinctures from her own vial, meticulously labeling the fakes to match the doctor's schedule. She was creating a theater of compliance, a grand lie to protect the twins from the very people paid to save them. Ji-hoon's heart hammered against his ribs with a violence that surpassed anything he had felt in the warehouse. He was witnessing a woman risk her life to execute a counterinsurgency in his own home. Every bottle she hid was a piece of evidence. Every fake dose she prepared was a gamble with the hangman. He realized then that Zara knew more about the dangers in his house than he did. She had seen the poison he was too arrogant to notice. As she moved back to the twins, her shadow looming large against the nursery wall, Ji-hoon felt a surge of terrifying respect. He was the one with the guns and the guards, yet he had been the one handing his children their slow death. Zara was the only one truly awake. He gripped the edge of his desk, the blue eye now focused not on a suspect, but on his only hope, watching her guard his children against a threat that shared his own name. The air in the hallway was colder than the rest of the mansion, a draft that felt as if it originated from the marble itself. Zara had stepped out of the nursery for only a moment to fetch fresh linens, her heart still drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs from the discovery of the tainted vials. She didn't get 5 paces before a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the gallery. Madame Park, Ji-hoon's stepmother, stood there like a statue of obsidian and silk. Her face was perfectly composed, her skin pulled tight in a youthful mask that did nothing to soften the predatory stillness of her eyes. She was the matriarch of the house, a woman whose influence was a quiet poison. And the way she looked at Zara was not with the disdain of a mistress for a servant, but with the calculated appraisal of a woman seeing a loose thread that needed to be burned. In the surveillance room, Ji-hoon's hand froze on his whiskey glass. He had switched the main feed to the hallway camera, a high-angle lens that made the two women look like players on a chessboard. He watched Madame Park glide toward Zara, her movements fluid and silent. He had always known his stepmother was ambitious, a woman who viewed his twins as obstacles to her own biological son's eventual inheritance, but he had dismissed her as a mere social climber. Now, seeing the way she cornered Zara, his blood turned to ice. "The children look remarkably well today," Madame Park said, her voice a sharp, melodic silver that carried perfectly through the hidden microphones. She didn't wait for a response. She stepped into Zara's personal space, her designer perfume clashing with the smell of the nursery's antiseptic. "Too well, perhaps. It is a tragedy when a foreign girl becomes overambitious. You might think you are helping, but in this country, people who interfere with the natural order of powerful families tend to disappear before their visas expire." She reached out, her gloved hand catching Zara's chin, forcing the younger woman to meet her gaze. "The doctor's medicine is for their benefit. If I see you deviate from the prescriptions again, I won't bother firing you. I will simply call immigration and tell them you've been stealing from the safe. Do you understand? Or should I speak more slowly?" Zara's spine was like a rod of iron. She didn't pull away, though the fear in her eyes was visible even through the grain of the digital feed. She stood her ground against the woman who held the keys to the kingdom, her voice steady and low. "I understand that I am here to keep them alive, madam. That is the only order that matters." Madame Park's smile was a thin, cruel line. Alive is a relative term. Be careful, girl. The walls in this house have ears and the shadows have teeth. She patted Zara's cheek, a gesture that was more of a slap than a caress, and swept past her, the train of her dress hissing against the floor like a serpent. Ji-hoon sat in the darkness, the blue eye finally seeing the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. He felt a visceral, sickening surge of clarity. The traitor wasn't a rival syndicate or a disgruntled soldier. It was the woman who sat at his dinner table. It was his own blood, or at least the woman who claimed the title. He watched Zara return to the nursery, her hands trembling as she locked the door from the inside, her eyes darting to the vents and the corners. She was terrified, but she was still there. She was a lamb in a den of wolves, and she was the only one protecting his cubs from the alpha. Ji-hoon stood up, the chair crashing to the floor behind him. The hunt was no longer for a disloyal maid, it was for the monster who shared his last name. He reached for his phone, his voice a jagged blade as he called his most loyal enforcer. Seal the house. No one leaves. Especially not my stepmother. The sky over Seoul didn't just break, it shattered. A localized supercell, violent and unpredicted, slammed into the city, drowning the skyscraper's glass facade in a deluge that turned the world outside into a swirling gray void. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. Ji-hoon paced the surveillance room, his eyes darting between the hallway feeds where his men stood like statues and the nursery where Zara was pacing. Then, at exactly 2:37 a.m., the digital world died. The monitors flickered once, bled into static, and then went black. The low hum of the mansion's climate control and the steady beep of the medical equipment vanished, replaced by an absolute terrifying silence that lasted only a heartbeat before the thunder roared. Ji-hoon lunged for his backup radio, but it emitted only the hissing white noise of a jammed frequency. This wasn't the storm. It was a blackout of surgical precision. The electronic locks on the nursery wing disengaged with a series of hollow clicks, and Ji-hoon knew the hit had begun. The Vipers were no longer hiding in the shadows, they were moving for the kill. Inside the nursery, the darkness was total. Zara gasped as the ventilators sighed their last mechanical breath and went still. For a second, the only sound was the rain lashing against the reinforced glass, and then the high-pitched, desperate wailing of the twins began. Without the heated incubators and the oxygen-rich air, their fragile systems began to panic. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached out in the dark, her hands finding the edge of Minjun's bed. His breathing was already changing, shallow, wet, and labored. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not tonight. Not on my watch." She fumbled for the emergency lantern she'd hidden in the diaper bin, its weak amber glow barely cutting through the gloom. The sight was a nightmare. Minjun was turning a haunting shade of blue, his tiny chest heaving in a futile rhythm. Next to him, Mji was gasping, her oxygen saturation dropping as the room's air grew heavy and cold. Zara knew the medical staff wouldn't come. They were either dead, compromised, or cowering. She was alone in a fortress that had become a tomb. She heard the first heavy thud against the oak door. It wasn't a knock. It was the shoulder of a man who didn't care about stealth anymore. The splintering of wood echoed through the room, punctuated by the sharp crack-crack of suppressed gunfire from somewhere down the hall. They were coming for the babies. And the only thing standing in their way was a woman with a glass dropper and a nursing degree she hadn't even finished yet. Zara grabbed the heavy dresser and shoved it with a strength born of pure, primal adrenaline, wedging it against the nursery door. Her hands shook as she turned back to the twins. Minjun's heart rate was slowing. She could feel it through his ribs, a fading tap against her palm. She didn't have the machines. She didn't have the power. She only had the air in her own lungs. She scooped Minjun up, pressing his tiny, cold body against her bare skin to share her warmth, and tilted his head back. She leaned down, covering his nose and mouth with hers, and gave him a puff of air. 1, 2, 3. Her eyes darted to Maji, who was beginning to turn pale. Zara felt a sob rise in her throat, but she choked it back. She shifted her weight, pulling MG into the crook of her other arm, alternating her breath between them, a desperate, rhythmic dance of life. Breathe for the son. Count to 3. Breathe for the daughter. Count to 3. Outside, the door groaned under another impact. A man's voice, rough and impatient, called out in Korean. Zara didn't need a translator to hear the death in his tone. She ignored the splintering wood and the shadows moving under the doorframe. She looked down at the 2 lives in her arms, her vision blurring with tears and the onset of hyperventilation. She began to hum the song from her homeland again, the melody jagged and broken by her gasping breaths. She was the only lung they had left, and she would breathe until her own heart stopped, right there on the floor in the dark. The hallway was a killing floor of marble and shadow. Ji-hoon moved with the predatory silence of a man who had been born in the dark, his breath ragged, but his hands steady. The emergency lights flickered a hellish red, illuminating the bodies of the guards who had betrayed him, men he had fed, men whose families he had protected, now lying in the wreckage of their own greed. His shoulder burned from a grazing bullet, and blood slicked his palm, making the grip of his handgun feel dangerously loose. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the only device in the mansion still connected to the nursery's independent battery-operated circuit. The screen flickered to life, a small glowing window into a sanctuary under siege. In the infrared grain, he saw her. Zara wasn't hiding under the bed. She wasn't pleading for her life. She was on the floor, a literal bridge between 2 dying infants. Ji-hoon stopped in the middle of the corridor, his back against the cold stone, unable to look away from the small screen. He watched as she tilted Minjun's head back with the precision of a surgeon and the tenderness of a mother, breathing her own life into his lungs. Then, without a second of hesitation, she pivoted to Maji, repeating the rhythmic, life-saving puff of air. He could hear her gasping through the phone's speaker, a wet, desperate sound. She was hyperventilating, her own oxygen levels likely plummeting as she sustained 2 lives with the capacity of 1. Another heavy impact shook the nursery door on the monitor, the wood splintering inward as the barrel of a rifle poked through the gap. Ji-hoon watched Zara's eyes. They were wide, brimming with a terrifying, crystalline fear, but they never left the children. She didn't flinch when a bullet whined through the upper panel of the door, showering her in splinters. She simply adjusted her body, curving her spine to act as a human shield for the twins, and leaned down to give MG another breath. "Hold on," Ji-hoon whispered to the empty air, his voice a jagged sliver of glass. "Just hold on." He shoved the phone into his pocket and rounded the corner. 3 men stood at the nursery door, one of them bracing a shoulder to break the final hinge while another aimed a suppressed submachine gun at the lock. Ji-hoon didn't give them the mercy of a warning. He fired with a rhythmic, cold-blooded efficiency, the muzzle flashes casting long, demonic shadows against the velvet wallpaper. He moved through the smoke like a vengeful ghost, his mind fixed only on the image of the woman on the other side of that door, the woman he had called an outsider, the woman he had intended to discard. The last of the assassins fell, and Ji-hoon slammed his weight against the heavy oak. It was barricaded from the inside, a testament to Zara's refusal to go quietly. "Zara, it's me!" he roared, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't felt since his wife's funeral. "Open the door!" There was a frantic scraping of furniture, the sound of the heavy dresser being dragged across the floor by someone with no strength left. When the door finally creaked open, the smell of cordite and rain rushed in. Ji-hoon stumbled into the nursery, his weapon raised, only to freeze. Zara was back on the floor, her face ashen, her lips tinged with a faint cyanotic blue. She didn't look up at him. She didn't ask if he was okay. She just leaned over Minjun, her chest heaving, and delivered one last shaky breath into his lungs. Ji-hoon dropped his gun. He fell to his knees beside her, his bloody hands hovering uselessly over the scene. He looked at the woman he had viewed through a lens of suspicion for a week, and for the first time he saw her with absolute clarity. She was the only heart beating in this house of stone. "I have them," he whispered, reaching out to support Maji's head as Zara's eyes began to roll back from exhaustion. "I have them now. You can breathe for yourself, Zara. Please, breathe." The morning sun broke through the dissipating storm clouds, casting a raw, golden light across the nursery floor that smelled of spent gunpowder and salt. Ji-hoon remained on his knees, and the fine wool of his trousers soaked with the blood of the men who had tried to extinguish his bloodline. He watched, mesmerized and humbled, as the twins began to stir. Their skin was no longer the deathly, translucent gray that had haunted his every waking hour. It was a vibrant, healthy pink, warmed by the frantic, selfless heat of Zara's own body. Minjin let out a sharp, indignant cry, a loud, rhythmic sound that was the most beautiful music Ji-hoon had ever heard. It was the sound of a life reclaimed from the threshold of the void. Zara lay slumped against the base of the rocking chair, her chest heaving as her own lungs fought to recover the oxygen she had gifted away. She looked at Ji-hoon, her eyes bloodshot and weary, yet filled with a fierce, defiant light. There was no fear left in her, only the quiet triumph of a woman who had looked into the eyes of the dragon of soul and outbattled his demons. Ji-hoon reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was no longer the clinical assessment of a suspicious employer. It was a gesture of profound, wordless reverence. He stood up slowly, his gaze moving to the corner of the room, where the pinhole lens of the secret camera sat embedded in the ceiling. He looked at it for a long moment, seeing his own reflection in the tiny glass eye, a man who had spent his life watching for betrayal and had almost missed a miracle. With a sudden violent motion, he reached up and tore the device from its housing, snapping the wires with a sharp crack. He walked back to the medical station and swept the remaining monitors off the desk, sending the expensive displays crashing to the floor in a heap of shattered glass and dead pixels. The blue eye was blind. He didn't need the feeds anymore. He didn't need the infrared telemetry or the thermal scans to tell him who this woman was. The proof was in the steady, even breathing of his children. "No more watching," he said, his voice thick with a resolve that shook the very foundations of the room. He turned to Zara, extending a hand to help her up from the floor. "From this moment, you are not a guest in this house, and you are certainly not a servant. You are the shield of my family. My word is your protection, and my life is the debt I owe you." The mansion was still filled with the echoes of the night's violence. The cleanup would be brutal, Nevoan, and the reckoning for Madame Park would be absolute. But within the four walls of the nursery, a new covenant had been forged. Ji-hoon realized that while he had built an empire of iron to protect his children, he had nearly let them wither in the cold. It was the outsider who had taught him that power without humanity was just a slow-acting poison. As the medical teams he actually trusted finally burst through the doors, Ji-hoon didn't move to the center of the room to command them. He stayed by Zara's side, watching as she gently laid MG back into a now-powered incubator. He looked at his twins, then at the woman who had saved them, and finally felt the ice in his soul vanish. He had spent his life looking for enemies in every shadow, but in the longest night of his life, he had found the only person he would ever truly trust. The dragon had found his heart, and he would burn the world before he let its fire go out again.